In just a moment, we're going to hear Jimmy R. Allen. And I'm not going to try to introduce Jimmy to you. I think 99% of you know Jimmy well. He is a part of this whole family. Jimmy, we are so pleased. Jimmy was my boss for a while. We both survived.
Thank you, Jace Jones, for being who you are. It's no surprise to any of us that you have shifted the gear away from yourself to Dr. Maston and Mrs. Maston, and we're grateful for that. There was another member of Mrs. Maston's family I want to remind you of before I move on into the remarks I have tonight. Joyce Williams, who is the mother of Lydia Williams, my daughter-in-law, is a member of Mrs. Maston's family. She's here. Joyce, would you stand? I usually thought of the valley of the shadow of death described in the 23rd Psalm as an experience of death itself. The assurance that was the good shepherd who had provided refreshing in life, guided our paths, protected us from the assaults of enemies, comforted and corrected us, would also go with us through the valley of the shadow of death. It brought encouragement to me and to those with whom I shared it. During the past decade, I've discovered new dimensions to that song. The promise of God about the valley of the shadow of death no longer waits until the end of the way to be claimed. The promise of the protection is to me not at the end of the way, but in the presence of death. We all live with it, the shadow of death. In the energetic activity of our lives and careers and home building and playing and working, we postpone our awareness of its presence until it comes crashing in on us. I come to you as my family in this moment, not as an expert on pain with the answers about its causes or techniques or formulas for coping with it. What you hear in the echoes of the valley of the shadow of death may not include enough of the hosannas we've come to expect from victories won and posted. I stagger wounded from the battle with the hoarse cry of one who still weeps through lonely nights in hotel rooms and grapples with the promises of God. Like Jacob and Jacob, I know that if I let go, all is lost. The struggle wrings out the soul. It probes to the deepest dimension of God's question. What is your name? What and who are you? I sometimes glimpse the glory of the sunshine, and often I live with a fresh gloom of the man crippled with the struggle, halting on the thigh, but caught up with the possibility of prevailing with God. I come to share discoveries in the valley of the shadow, some deeply disturbing aspects of the journey, some green pastures and still waters discovered in unexpected places, and some deep convictions about the challenges we face as believers in walking with the shepherd in our contemporary world. The nightmare began for me with a late night telephone call 8 years ago. I was at the Stoker Hotel in Nashville, Tennessee. My day had been frustrating and exhausting as I sought to persuade a group of denominational bureaucrats to alter the massive budget of the Southern Baptist Convention slightly in order to achieve daily access through cable television to millions of homes. They were not about to do it. The call was from Colorado Springs. I just returned from a visit there. Our newest grandson, Brian, had been born to Scott and Lydia. He'd been in and out of the hospital. Lydia had another difficult delivery from a trouble-plagued pregnancy, and Matthew was 3. He also had a premature birth and a great number of complications. We got a call from the blood bank in California. They tell us that some of the blood Lydia received in the transfusion during Matthew's birth was contaminated with HIV virus. We tested. Lydia, Matthew, and Brian are all positive. I tested negative. HIV, what does that mean? AIDS. Should I come? Not yet. We'll let you know. The world went into a whirl. I pictured the flaming home of the little boys in Florida who had AIDS by transfusion and were driven from their school and town by the fear-crazed behavior of people. A youngster named Brian White was in lawsuit trying to go to school in the Midwest, and our family had AIDS. I flew home to tell one of them. I still have clearly in mind the ordeal. Sometimes something happened in the household which was fretting her. I sat with her in the living room of our Fort Worth home and said, "Let me tell you about the problem we really had." She listened carefully and calmly, and we talked about what we should do. We'd walked through many a valley, but nothing nearly like this one. Her courage and her insight then and all the way through the experience has been awesome to me. Since she'd had so many struggles with depression, I was really unprepared for her demonstration of such strength. AIDS is the curse of yesterday's leprosy. The same fear which drove people to isolate lepers, the same breakdown of body which leprosy did to lives, the same despair in search for solution characterizes our society's experience with it. It complicates the issue when the element of shame and guilt can be added to justify our frozen attitudes of condemnation. We're now reaping a harvest of death from AIDS. Cornelius Baker, Director of Policy for the National Association of People with AIDS, points out this last week, and I quote, "The only time you see fatality rates like these is in wartime, as this disease is robbing this nation of its future," end of quote. While accurate figures are difficult to obtain because of the nature of secrecy and the pattern of the victims, Dr. John Ward of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention announced last week that at least 201,775 adults and 2,615 children have died in our nation of AIDS. The next 14 months will claim another 130,000 lives. I found out something about statistics. They don't mean anything. They even become a sedative to the conscience of the nation when projections are not accurate and we're, quote, doing better than we thought. What means something is that every one of those pediatric numbers is a child, bright, inquisitive, quick to laugh, trained not to kiss, but to say often, "I need a hug." We're talking about what T.V. Maston called folks, people for whom Christ died. Scott and Lydia decided that the ethical thing to do was to tell the church pastor, where he was an assistant minister, about the problem. After all, Matt had been coming to the children's programs, Brian had been in the nursery. There might be some need to double check to make sure no HIV virus had been spread to the others. That week, the church fired him with a period of pay. They accepted a letter of resignation which he had never written. It was our first taste of the reaction of people to the issue of AIDS in that time period and season. That church failed. It was not to be our last experience like that. Lydia could no longer nurse. Scott could no longer pastor. The decision was made for them to come to our townhouse home in Texas. It was then that we began to learn the burden of a secret. I never realized the intensity of the burden of a secret. The full impact of trying to tell those with a need to know and yet protect privacy was to create a tension impossible to describe. Early on, we decided that the protection of Matthew was for a normal life as he could have for as long as he could have it, would be the sum and bone, the highest good of the situation. It guided all our actions. I must say it's been a largely successful venture. In the most part, this is true because Scott is the best father I've ever known. The time and energy and love he's invested makes it happen. Perhaps the best way to describe to you the process is to let Lydia tell it. She did so in an article which is in most of your homes. It came in May of 1987. She wrote it anonymously and changed the description of the sex of her child to a girl rather than a boy. It was published in the Baptist Standard. In an article entitled, "Wearing the Scarlet Letter, AIDS." And this is what the article says. When teaching phonics to my preschooler, we started at the beginning of the alphabet. "What? This is the letter A," I said. "Do you know a word that begins with A?" The poignant reply came, "A is for AIDS." So it is in our lives. A is for AIDS. It's the beginning and the ending of every facet of our existence. We are the new untouchables. I've become infected with the AIDS virus by a blood transfusion while still pregnant with my first child. As a result, our baby also contracted the virus. Although I was frequently ill and fatigued, I passed it off as being the new mother syndrome. Our baby was quite ill as well, beginning weekly trips to the doctor, and I blamed much of my exhaustion on stress, having no idea that I was carrying the AIDS virus. 2 years after the birth of my first child, I became pregnant again. Our second child was premature and also had multiple medical problems. When the new baby was 5 months old, I received a call from the blood bank that had supplied the blood for my transfusion. They said that the donor who had given the blood for my transfusion had AIDS. My world started reeling. As soon as I heard the words, all the events of the past 3 years came into focus with a searing clarity. The children's inability to stay well, the doctor's frequent head shaking and statements, "This is rare, this medicine should have worked." Within 2 months, I had lost most of what constituted my world. Our baby was in critical condition with days or weeks to live. My husband had lost his job and career when his employer found out that his family had been touched with AIDS. Our older child had to be removed from daycare. We were asked not to return to our church. Our confidentiality had been breached, and as word spread through our community, we quickly fled and relocated to another town. We were too terrified to risk harassment and persecution. Several months after our move, our baby died, and the second phase of my isolation began. This isolation was self-imposed by fear. The few relationships I are superficial and almost totally based on fabrication. How could I truthfully answer simple questions? Why did you move here? What was wrong with your baby? I couldn't talk about the fact that my heart was breaking every time I looked at my little boy. I couldn't share the fact that my marriage was fragmenting from the incredible stress in our lives. I couldn't act sick lest somebody get suspicious, so I hid my symptoms and pain. I didn't dare reveal anything about the severity of our son's illness, lest my child be totally ostracized from all socialization. I couldn't even contact former co-workers to explain why I suddenly disappeared. I was in a new city with no friends, no church, no home. We left home, no job, a struggling marriage, a very sick child, and a grief for our baby who had died. I had never been so alone in my life. We reached out to a local church. The pastor was supportive, but when he asked parents about the possibility of our child attending Sunday school, the parents said no. We do not attend church now. The rejection runs too deep. To Christians, I would say that AIDS cripples not only the body, but the heart. At a time when the AIDS victim is dealing with death and dying, heavy financial burden, physical debilitation, they need support, care, concern, not rejection. If there ever was a time to reach out and touch the lepers of our day, it's now. I wear the scarlet A. I keep it well hidden. You may never see me cry or realize from my appearance that I've been affected by the virus. Nevertheless, I've been shattered. I need love, compassion, and community to help me make it from day to day. I've done nothing immoral or illegal to contract this disease. But those who have hurt just as deeply as I. Their needs are as great or greater than mine for a compassionate and loving response to AIDS. That's the end of the article. It was just another page in the State Baptist paper, but it was a shaft to the heart of this bread pocket. Lydia's been gone now. She died almost 2 years ago. Last week, I I visited the Pediatric AIDS Daycare Center in this city, founded by her and named Brian's House. Last week, more than 80 children and families of children devastated by AIDS received their loving, cheerful, and essential support. It's good. It's not enough, but it's good. It's too late for Lydia, but it's not too late for others. But it's an echo from the valley. And in this, she, being dead, yet speaks. There are some deeply disturbing aspects to this journey. The churches are dysfunctional families. I grew up in a family committed to starting churches, ministry to need. My dad and mother started their ministry. I was 8 years old. I'd already decided that Jesus was to be Lord in my life. I was nurtured by people who lived that way. My earliest experience was helping start a church in a house near the Little Mexico area of downtown Dallas. A church had moved out of the neighborhood. The people needed to be spiritually reached. We started with a rented house, borrowed chairs, a donated piano, living in the same house where the church was to meet. No one waited for the slow and difficult moving of denominational bureaucracy. The local church was the place in which God did business. Starting with new Christians, uninvolved Christians, and misfits, I was aware of the frailty of the family of faith, but I also found that it basically functioned with compassion and help, and best of all, God was there. Lives were changed. Rescuing the perishing was more than a song we sang. It was a wonderful matrix out of which to grow the pastoral praise of my work. When God blessed us with the opportunity of a downtown ministry in the exciting city of San Antonio, I saw a caring congregation reach out to the untouchables. The poorest of the poor were fed daily meals, given medical help, encouraged to come out of hopelessness and irresponsibility into disciplined lives, taught the Word of God, taught to read, helped out of drugs and prostitution. For every social climber we missed, God gave us similarly skilled and gifted people who came because of what we were. As the church baptized more new converts one year than any congregation in America, it was doing all those risk-taking things to function as a family. But AIDS brought a new challenge and a different response to the churches we encountered as a family. When the children were moved from Colorado to Texas, they began searching for a church for Matthew and for themselves. Battered by their firing of the church in Colorado, they were shell-shocked. They dreaded rejection. So find out first, we decided. I joined quietly in that effort. In my heart, I hope to find someone who could design a way of bringing this energetic 3-year-old into a group of children in which he could learn about Jesus like the other children were doing. Churches have become places in which what I call the science of people gathering has reached new heights. We know now how people must be served in a homogeneous fashion, well cared for, comforted, entertained. The competition is severe. The debt on the building is high. We can't afford to lose anyone over anything. Fear of a deadly disease would panic everyone. One of the heartbreaking aspects of the search was that in some cases, pastors conferred with medical doctor members thinking they would find allies in the effort. But no 1,000% certainty of guarantees were forthcoming. In order to cover their liabilities, the doctors were saying, we don't know enough to be sure. Something may turn up or will turn up that might show that this infectious threat is greater than we know. 8 years ago, that super caution chilled efforts of some to act wisely by doing the risk-taking of Jesus of Nazareth as he reached out to touch lepers. The first man in history to voluntarily touch lepers didn't die of leprosy. He died at the hands of religious leaders who wouldn't touch a leper on the bed. My favorite term for church still is family of faith. However, I found the family dysfunctional. Our society is filled with dysfunctional families. We know what that is. The design is right. The desire is present. The doing of it has gone tragically astray. Dysfunctional families have distorted value systems. It often comes from a breakdown of communication between members of the family. They're victimized by the stress of survival needs, the pressure of time-consuming activities which keep them away from each other, and the appetites for personal ego needs which are not filled. Families of faith are similarly going astray. They miss their mission because words substitute for reality instead of describing. Success patterns centering allegiance to dynamic human personalities. The church becomes a place in which people are collected rather than a family in which people are nurtured. Risk-taking is difficult for individuals and virtually impossible for groups. Reinhold Niebuhr caught the heart of the problem years ago as he spoke of moral man and immoral society. We fail to muster the will to act as groups by the high standards we can demonstrate as individuals. We have found that to be true. Individual Christians came to rally to us. One left a seminary career to travel across the nation to take up residence nearby, to be of help to our AIDS-plagued family. People came to give themselves in labor to help furnish a house. Persons contributed money to the salary of the volunteer system which had evolved to support the Interfaith AIDS Task Force. But when the churches were asked to act, they universally failed to do so. There's difficulty also in this battle, in loving past our differences. The most explosive of damage to relationships comes with a combination of dealing with gays and gays. Either of these problems wreak havoc in the hearts. Because I take the Bible seriously as the authority for life, there is no way I can discover to justify acting out homosexual behavior. Scriptures pile on scriptures about the intention of God in creation. Male and female created them. These days, serious Christians are wrestling with this problem. There's some effort to lighten the load of evidence by attacking the words of Scripture and reasoning from the wonder of the love of God that he must have just had to deal with mankind in these terms because we were at an unenlightened stage. There are genetic evidences turning up in scientific studies that some may be born with this sexual orientation. And this becomes proof to some bewildered believers that God must have intended this behavior despite the Bible's words. Searching through the minefield of ideas to find principles of fidelity and moderation which apply to all relationships, they deal with the homosexual issue by calling for a style of responsible behavior within the same gender commitments. AIDS is no respecter of persons. The virus is transferred through fluid exchange from a diseased person to a healthy. Blood transfusions are obvious ways of doing it. Injections by needles are effective ways of doing it. The greatest publicity and the greatest stigma of the problem of this epidemic, however, is that means of sexual intercourse and homosexual behavior is one in which the virus thrives. The explosions of fear across the nation are accelerated by the thundering pulpit voices calling it the judgment of God on sinful behavior. They, quote unquote, deserve it. Blame them, quote unquote. The scapegoat is easy to spot. 10 to 15% of our permissive society are written out of the books of humanity. They gather, regroup, organize to fight back. The louder their voices, the more strident their self-defense, the more demanding and off-the-wall their statements, the deeper the problem grows. Suffocating beneath the load of those hostile and angry encounters, quietly in anguish and pain, are the parents and children of faith who are rejected and blamed because sons or daughters are having to cope with sexual desires for their own gender. I'm reminded of the story of comedian Jerry Clout. He was in an interview at a Boston radio talk show during the days when the nation was debating whether to grant amnesty to those who had avoided the draft in protest over the Vietnam War. After a pleasant conversation, the host suddenly says, "When we get back from this break, Jerry will tell us what he thinks of amnesty." 90 seconds later, Clower had to answer. His response was classic, as he often does. "Now let's see. Are we talking about your boy or my boy? If it's your boy, I'd say leave him in that foreign country where he ran. If it's my boy, I'd just soon he'd come home. Our son Skip is one of the most talented, sensitive human beings I've ever known. Spiritually inclined and musically gifted, high sense of humor. He struggled through adolescence with the purpose of God for his life. I lived through his rebellions and his repentances. I was inwardly sure that he would end up serving God in some vocational way. I thought I'd die the day it dawned on me that he was gay. The hellish path he walked as he was driven to try deception, attempted suicide, alcoholism, and 1,000 promises to himself and God. And through it all, we loved each other, kept reaching for each other, but the chasm was very deep. The 12-step program was the instrument of God to help him turn to holiness. He acknowledged his needs and moved out of his victim stage to let God move to empower him to take charge of his life. I discovered a new perception of the Scripture, which says he saved others and himself he cannot save. I was part of the problem and couldn't affect the solution to it. He had to find it on his own. I'm grateful for the love and the respect for me, which caused him to try to avoid damaging what I sought to be and to do. Through conversations and therapies, he sought to express his frustrations. Our differences of opinion are deep and continue to be so, but we love each other through them. I respect him. I love him. He's carving out a meaningful life and helping others. He loves God, and he's HIV positive. Wanda manages it better than I do. Mothers just seem to do that. Our challenge is one of loving each other past our differences. There are those who refuse to let that happen. If you don't accept my lifestyle, you reject me. The secret is that what your behavior is at any given moment, and may or may not be, a reflection of what you really are. I have a lifestyle, but it's not all of me. The biblical term in that question is whether or not you can love the sinner and despise the sin. Jesus managed to do that. God does it all the time. To the degree His Spirit indwells us, it can become a pattern of life. Judgmentalism is deadly to human relationships. But love goes past that, to the heart of the matter. Persons are more than the sum of their parts. We move beyond theology to love. There are some green pastures and still waters in the valley. The shepherd promises provision, green pastures, still waters, a restored soul, guidance in right ways, the strength of his rod, and the correction of his staff, the shield from the blows of enemies, at least at tough meal times, an anointed refreshing of the mind, and a thirst-slaking cup of sustenance. I come to bear testimony from the valley that his promises are all true. There is encouragement from personal relationships. He does it in unexpected ways. A network of friends emerges with life-sustaining touch, even when they're unaware of what an encouraging word or a genuine prayerful intercession is really meaning. Some of you in this room have provided green pastures to our experiences. The 12-step people are not the only ones who discovered that day at a time living is the survival strategy for the stressed. I don't know how we're going to make this decade without the sensitive and constant response of the Christian Life Commission family. I dare not attempt to call your names as friends, pastoral colleagues, and donors to Mission Service Corps, and laypersons who walk supportively beside an exhausted man trying to hold up heads before God in the midst of battle. And God does it so gently, so gently. A call comes from a friend, and he doesn't even know the need he's filling, or she's filling. An opportunity to serve is presented. One of the most difficult things and deadly traps of this disease is to make the disease and the struggle with it the center of all of our lives. God tells us not to seek first our survival, but His kingdom, and service helps that happen. There's an encouragement from the improvement of church's AIDS response. One of the sources of refreshing for me lies in the fact that so many churches involved in our experience have altered their pattern and worked out ways to respond to AIDS persons. One church pastor who's here tonight reported some 70 churches which have secured advice and assistance from their policy and planning. Similar responses are coming, and it's late, but it's still essential for us to function as families. A letter from the executive of the Women's Missionary Union of the Southern Baptist Convention this week informed me that our largest Christian organization in the nation has adopted as their social issue for next year the challenge of AIDS. There's encouragement from the improvement of how the church families are becoming more functional as we relate to AIDS. There's encouragement for us from the environment of a beautiful place. I couldn't complete this thought without telling you how awed we are by the way God has provided us one of the most responsive and loving groups of Christians we've ever encountered in one of the loveliest spots on the planet. The Big Canoe Chapel is on the first of the Appalachian Mountains in Big Canoe, Georgia. Is a major factor in our discovery of still waters and green pastures. The beauty of God's creation when you live 4,000 feet high on a mountain surrounded by trees and vistas, deer and others of God's creatures, sunrises and sunsets, becomes God's therapy to the soul. There's encouragement from the mystical and awesome presence. I hesitate to verbalize this, lest it be construed as claiming more than I experience, but the bottom line of the shepherd's promise for the valley of the shadow is not circumstance, but presence. And there are times and seasons when the flashes of it provide perspective. There's an awesome awareness that escapes words. I experienced it this week as I came over here. A friend sent me from another state, a lay person I had once ministered to, a letter of encouragement. And in it he sent a tape that he had just duplicated to give to his wife, or they were in a struggle time. And he said, I just thought you might like to receive it. It was a 1978 sermon that I preached on Habakkuk, on living life's questions. It was unbelievable as I drove toward the airport to hear God using something I said and thought 15 years ago to speak to me today. As I listened, I realized that what I had said had come true in my journey over and over again. And that God was somehow giving me hinds feet and letting me know that to justify don't live by what they can do or what they think they can do. They simply live by faith. Sometimes that awesome presence escapes words, and we need to tiptoe around it because we really can't describe it. As far as I know, no one in our family has ever, one time, at least to each other, asked Job's question about why, or why us. Life doesn't come in simple equations. Why not us? Is not God's strength adequate to carry us through the trials that our fellow human beings are encountering? What's the good of a gospel which works only when the sun shines and the living's easy? Why not us? Stretching our emotional and spiritual muscles to the breaking point is the way they develop. Athletes know it. They do it with their physical muscles deliberately, even scientifically. They grow strength from that struggle. Why not us? And the difference for me is the presence. Look at some of the challenges to be met. For life to be meaningful, it must be pitched toward future tense. It's not enough for us to examine our wounds except to treat them, to lament our mistakes except to learn from them, to glory in our accomplishments except to draw strength from them. We need to move on. Some challenges for our agenda include the fact that we can pray for a cure to AIDS. told by well-meaning prayer warriors that our child will live if we pray for him to be an exception. I pray daily for him to live life to the fullest. But the kind of prayer I'm asked to pray seems more denial to me than faith for me. I pray for something bigger than that. I pray that the great physician will lead to the breakthrough which will bring a cure for that devastating disease called AIDS. Is it unthinkable that intensely concentrated, faith-driven prayers of millions of believers might be the factor which is catalytic to the breakthrough for a cure for AIDS? We tend to pray casually and spasmodically about such matters. But the aha moments of scientific breakthrough, the hunches of researchers, the funding of adequate resources for the research to be enhanced, even created by the fervent, effectual prayer of the righteous. We can work for prevention. It's controversial because so many object to condom education programs proposed as public policy. But there's no room for Christians to hide from the responsibility to work for the prevention of this death-dealing disease. A Christian strategy is essential in this prevention effort. If it's not to be condoms as a stopgap while ethical ideals of persuasion to abstinence from promiscuous behavior take precedent, we must answer to God for what we have done. We must come up with something better. The war against AIDS, the recovery of Christian idealism and sexual behavior is essential for human well-being. Lamenting the efforts of others is no substitute for our own work in preventing AIDS. We can share ideas for ministry. This T.B. Maston Foundation would be of the spirit and attitude of the man whose name it bears if it set itself to securing the resources to create a clearinghouse for strategies for biblically committed Christians and churches to minister to families and victims of AIDS. Of course, such pooled information may exist through various interfaith efforts and some denominational resources, but many of our churches would profit from a group like this, verifying and validating ways Christians are finding to minister to the untouchables. The psalm concludes with, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." An insurance executive recently reminded me that nothing can follow you unless you're moving. Forging ahead through the valley of the shadow becomes the basis for claiming the promise of the goodness and the mercy. As I do so, I hope the echo you hear will be one of discovery and of joy through whatever the shadow